Time now for a look at the international press. I'm joined by Elena Casas. Elena, thanks very much for coming on. I imagine that just as very much in the last few days and weeks, Syria continues to take up much of the attention of the international press.
Yes, absolutely. It's all over front pages again. Assad's slaughter of the innocents is the headline at The Independent. They've got reports, as indeed we've had in bulletins today, about what's happening to people there in Homs. Also, they've got something not a lot of other papers have, which is a story from inside Damascus, to where supposedly the situation is at peace. There aren't tanks in the streets in the middle of the capital. They're looking at some of the very rich businessmen who are actually managing to profit from the sanctions that have been imposed on Iran. There are sanctions now on oil, gold, diamonds, mineral exports, and they're talking about a number of businessmen who are managing to profit from this by routing transactions to the West through intermediaries in Lebanon and taking a cut out of it. So there are some people who are managing to do well from this. Now, what should the West do then if these sanctions are actually helping some people in the regime, or at least according to the paper, only really affecting the poorest people? Well, the Times reports the US is seriously considering military intervention. Whether or not this really is on the table has been a subject of debate for the papers over the last few days, but they say their sources have it on fairly reliable information that they really are considering covertly arming the Syrian opposition. The Times' editorial is a very strongly worded plea for that to happen. They say that if you did arm the Syrian opposition, there would be a risk of the country collapsing into sectarianism. They reckon an uncertain future is better than the bloody certainties of the present, according to that editorial. But then The Guardian takes an entirely opposite point of view. Their writer Simon Tisdall says that the West is engaged in a conspiracy to do nothing, by which they mean that the US might be making the right noises for the Syrian opposition, but they're so worried about getting involved in another war in the Middle East, the chances of them realistically doing anything, according to him, are nil, because it would mean getting involved in not just a Syrian conflict, but really a proxy conflict for the whole Middle East, because the Syrian regime is being strongly backed up by Iran, and the last thing they want to do is accidentally find themselves in conflict with Iran.
Now, the other big news story that we've been following these last couple of days is, of course, this sweep that Rick Santorum made in Minnesota and Missouri and Colorado. What have the papers made of his series of victories?
Well, a lot of people took it as rather a surprise, but according to the New York Times' Andrew Rosenthal, actually, it's logical that Santorum should be doing so well, because he best represents the Republican Party that we've come to know over the last few years. That means not just very conservative on social issues, but also on fiscal and tax issues. He's very, very anti-federal government, as indeed is the Republican base, because it's difficult for Mitt Romney or Newt Gingrich to really position themselves as against Washington government, because both have spent decades making a career in Washington government, whereas Santorum genuinely comes from the outside, and he genuinely believes, at least according to the New York Times, that things like universal health care or bank bailouts are in some way an assault on the freedom of Americans, and so the Republican voters take that sort of as more genuine, his belief in very conservative fiscal policy than the other candidates. But that victory makes him better placed to then continue attacking Mitt Romney in the future, because it helps him attract money for his campaign donations. That's the other big thing about his victory of Tuesday night. That's what The Independent is looking at. They reckon he's made $1 million in donations in the last 24 hours.
Now, we're also going to have a look at another election, this time a regional one in India, Elena.
Yes, it might not sound very important internationally, but The Hindu says that the regional election going on in Uttar Pradesh, the country's biggest state at the moment, actually is terribly important, because if their regional president Mayawati does really well, that would put her party as to being very important on the national stage. She's been accused of demagoguery and even cultishness by that paper, because she's from the Untouchables caste, and her whole appeal is based on an identity politics that sort of tells the story of the Untouchables and very much plays on their history of oppression. But according to The Hindu, her history sort of writes out the oppression suffered by other groups, and so it would be very worrying if it became a major force in national politics.
And finally, Elena, an extraordinary story in The Guardian about how wealthy Chinese parents managed to get around the one-child rule.
Yes, this is about one very wealthy couple in Guangzhou who've caused a national scandal in China because they managed to have 8 babies at the same time, all about the same age, through different surrogate mothers. Now, they say surrogacy is completely unregulated in China, so for those couples wealthy enough to pay a surrogate, it means they can avoid the one-child rule completely.
An extraordinary picture on that paper. It's rather grabbed my attention. Elena Casas, thanks very much indeed. That was the International Press Review. Just coming up to 20 past